took them all away.
Because he said he owned the wall.
Well, he owned the plot.
In fact, he did, yes.
All I can remember is having this garden that we're standing on now.
Yes. Yes.
In 1940,
I may be wrong on that.
46 or 47.
Yes, you had allotment on it.
I had this allotment.
Yes, on this one.
That's
Divided into 4.
4,
That's right.
that's right. Quite big, really, you know,
Yeah.
when you think from that to halfway across.
The green is a focal point of village celebrations. Pictures abound of the floats and extravert displays by otherwise staid villagers. In 1981, the Reverend Gilbert Turner was the Queen Mother, and at the age of 77, Dennis Barrett portrayed a sweep. A great many village children will carry the memory of Dennis, who still plays his concertina for them at playgroup. And each year, Cropwell Butler has entered and on 2 occasions won the Best Kept Village competition.
Behind the smithy, Cheatham's bakery worked until the 30s. The village at that time had at least 2 bakeries, and many housewives baked bread at home, and some of the other shopkeepers sold bread and cakes. Next to Cheatham's, at the end of the building, was a former barn, later in 1845 to become the primitive Methodist chapel, apparently capable of holding a congregation of up to 50. Today, only a wall remains. After falling into disuse when the 2 branches of Methodism combined in the 20s, the chapel was converted into a new smithy, and for many years continued to run from here. In 1967, it was extended at the front as an agricultural engineers service until in 1985, Phil Harrison, last of 3 generations of blacksmiths, retired and the property was sold. The lane to the left of the smithy, known as Blacksmith's Lane, passes Grange Cottages and Bramble Cottage, latterly the home of the late Mr. Pip Burden for many years, when it became very overgrown. Back to Hardigate. At the corner with the green stands the old post office. Almost certainly this was not the very first post office in the village, but it was operational in the 1880s, when it was run by Michael Thirlby, baker, shopkeeper, carrier and sub-postmaster. In 1893, it was established as a telegraph office, and the plaque commemorating the occasion was placed on the front by Henry Smith, who, the story goes, sent telegrams by the score to ensure that the office would remain viable. The house and land around it, early this century, became the home of the Lewises, who began as carriers. In 1925 started the bus service to Nottingham and Newark. Behind the house they built a large iron shed to store at first their carriers' wagons and later the buses. In the 30s, Jack Lewis moved the shed with the help of his new recruit Dennis Barrett to the site next to the present Barrett and Swan showroom, which building was itself the home of Jack Lewis, now incorporated into the showroom structure.
Primrose Cottage, in this century, before conversion to a house, was a tackle room and workshop. Earlier still it had been a cobbler's shop, and even earlier, towards the end of the last century, a reading room.
It was always called a reading room, but I can never remember it being a reading room.
Yeah.
But what my daddy used to say, he used to have quite a few, I don't know who used to run it, I'm sure. And they used to have quite a few books, you know, a variety of books, and people could go and sit in it and look them through or take them away and then take them back later. But the first I can remember it being used was as a cobbler's shop.
Yeah.
And that was used only once a week by a full-time cobbler who lived at Cropwell Bishop, named Mr. Wilford.
Looking up Hardigate, we can see the changes in the pictures over the years since 1900. The right-hand side was gardens belonging to the cottages of the left. At the far end, Grange Farm Stackyard, during a succession of ownerships, was later the Midland Model Dairy under Mr. Beardsley, then owner of the Grange.
Cows and the milking machines and all that thing that we had, which in a village this size was rather unusual.
So you must have had quite a lot of land, presumably.
Well, yes, because all that side of the road
Yeah.
that now Samworth bought,
Yeah, Samworth.
and where all the new houses are, you see. And
The Grange itself, hidden from view, was built in 1837 by Joseph Marriott Esquire, replacing an older Grange close by, which was then taken down. In this century it was for some time the house of the Carringtons, and passed into the ownership of the Parkins, during whose tenure on May the 12th, 1941, German bombers made 2 runs over the village, dropping incendiaries during the first, one of which dropped straight through the poplars, and on the second run, several high-explosive bombs in a line parallel with the road from north to south. One of these exploded near the Grange, killing Mrs. Parkin, 21-year-old land girl Barbara Ward, and a maid, Barbara Stewart, who was 18. Mr. Tom Wilson also lost an arm during the raid. More recently, the farm buildings were sold for development to become Grange Park.
Opposite Grange Park, Barrett's farm, beside which stood the mud cottage, which is a well-known view of old Cropwell. This was taken down in the 60s and replaced with the chalet bungalow, which is there now. Mud houses can survive for many years. They are built of wattle and daub, straw and mud, on a framework of rough timber, sometimes simply tree branches. They have a characteristic design, and many can still be found in villages around Cropwell. One such is part of the cottage at Tythby Corner, and another well preserved at Plungar. Barrett's farm was a small enterprise which had been in the Barrett family for generations. In the 50s, 2 young apprentice joiners, Roy Barrett, aged 24, and Arthur Swan, 21, decided against parental advice to become partners as jobbing joiners. Their first workshop occupied the old barn in the Barrett farmhouse. Specialising in bespoke built-in furniture and specialist joinery, the business steadily grew, and expansion resulted in the premises today, occupying over 6,000 square feet and providing work for a large number of employees. The farmhouse, one of the oldest in the village, dates from about 1760.
Next to it, Court Cottage formed of 3 little dwellings formerly known as Hardigate Cottages, reputedly housed the servants of the court. By the 30s they were simply rather primitive, tumble-down houses with few facilities.
Such cottages form the bulk of the residential part of Hardigate, but in the centre was Miller's Bakery, later to become Branston's. It was from here that, by tradition, the Christmas dole bread was issued to deserving villagers, paid for out of the interest on the Fillingham and Marriott charities. Branston's continued in business until 1971.
In buildings behind Hardigate Cottages stands the pork pie maker's Mrs. Elizabeth King, a name in this trade since 1853, but more recently revived by Mr. Kenneth Parr, who after retiring as chairman and managing director of Pork Farms, took this smaller business as a retirement hobby.
West Lee, the elegant mansion on the corner of the Green, was from 1868 to 1902 the home of the curates and vicars of the parish. Until 1868 it belonged to Mr. John Marriott Esquire. The Marriotts were major landowners and benefactors to the village.
Next to Westlea we come across Lilac Cottage and Leather Bottle Cottage, both replacements for earlier buildings.
The Leather Bottle Inn was a pub until 1868.
And I took it off his hands, as it were, I suppose, really. And I said, I think something had been spent on the house. I've never been here since that day. And we go by in the car, so I don't even know what it looks like now. It was all called Leather Bottle, and the actual building of the pub was still at the back. Two endways on, facing the same way as the house is there now. Because Mrs. Flint was living in one. But that seems to have disappeared.
Behind it, another tumble-down cottage, Lilac Cottage, was occupied by a reputed miser, Thomas Clifton.
Next door, a row of cottages, now replaced by Maythorne and the White House, feature in many postcards of earlier years. Beyond this, Newton House, owned until 1985 by Phil Harrison, the last blacksmith, and for 12 years the parish chairman. The old police house, built around 1928, was successor to the corner house in Main Street as the home of the village bobby.